want to welcome you here tonight. If this is your first time being at Good Shepherd, we're so glad that you've joined us here tonight. And I'm pretty confident in saying you will be glad that you came tonight. There's some great information that you're going to hear tonight. Just a couple announcements that I want to make sure you're aware of. Dr. Bierle has written a book called Surprised by Faith. Most of you, I think, got a copy as you came in. The church has decided to give 50 copies away free, one per household. If there's still some left later on, we're going to give them away still, so you can have more than one if you'd like. But they are selling the books if you'd like multiple copies. They're selling them for $7 a piece. There's many other great resources available on the table as you came in. One other thing I'd like to point out regarding this book, Surprised by Faith. If you would like to be part of a discussion group, there's a sign-up sheet on the table where these books are located. What we're going to do is, as a church, and whoever would like to join us, read through the book, meet together on a Sunday evening about once a month approximately as we work our way through this book. There's some discussion questions at the end of each chapter. It'll be a great time. I hope that you can join us. So if you'd like to do that, sign up in the back where these books are located. We will be taking a brief break about midway through the session tonight. And I guess, Dr. Bierle, you get to decide when you want that to happen. But just want to make sure you are aware of that. And let's see here. Any announcements you have, Dr. Bierle? Okay. So if you are not familiar with Dr. Don Bierle, there's a few things you might be interested in knowing. The short version is he's well qualified to talk about what he's going to talk about tonight. Okay? That's the short version. He's a PhD biologist. He's also got his master's in New Testament studies. He was on a research scientific expedition to the North and South Poles. So he's been there and done that in terms of science. He was an educator for 35 years, teaching biology, biblical studies, and worldview subjects in the college classroom. He's the author of several books and video series, and he has spoken at conferences around the world in places such as the Marshall Islands, Amsterdam, the Philippines, and throughout India. He's the president of Faith Search International. His wife, Vernay, is with him tonight, and they have 2 married sons and 6 grandchildren. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Don Bierle.
Thank you very much. Not only is my wife here, but at the break, you need to stop and greet her and say happy birthday. It's her birthday today. So of course, I should have ordered a cake or something, but I didn't. So you'll just have to drink water at the break. We'll go to a point where we can stop comfortably and we'll take a short break, whether it be bathroom break or grab a little movement around and get yourself awake again. And then we'll get back. But if you take too long, then you'll end up staying later. Okay? So I need the time that we have to really get through the material that we have, and I hope that you will want to finish it. In the second half, I'll be sharing some things that are perhaps a bit more personal, including my own testimony for as I was going through my bachelor's, master's, and PhD, I left everything relating to Christianity. I left God, I left the church, I left faith, and did not believe it was true. And I became an evolutionist, and all that goes with that, non-belief in God and so forth. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end and what happened. Otherwise, if something didn't happen, I would not be here, right? Doing what I'm presenting, the evidence for the Christian faith. So that's what we call faith search discovery. Discovering the reasons why the Christian faith is true. And using mostly external evidence. Not quoting Bible verses. I will have a few along the way, but that won't be my dependence. I'll be dependent upon external evidence, which was really the basis on which I changed my mind and about the whole Christian faith. That's why the book you have in your hand is called Surprised by Faith, because my concept of faith was it was for fools. And I was surprised that there could be reasons. There was evidence to support the idea of Christian faith, and so I called it Surprised by Faith. Besides that, I was highly influenced during that transformation as I began to read books by other people who had been into what we call apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith. And one of those people, and you probably will recognize the name, C.S. Lewis. Some of you know and have read things by C.S. Lewis. And he was probably the most influential writer that got through to me, because in order to change my heart, he had to satisfy my mind. Now that may sound prideful, and it was, but he had to get to my heart through my mind. And he did. And he has a book that talks about his conversion, because he was an atheist before he became a Christian, and it's called Surprised by Joy. So, in a sense, out of respect for the man who did so much to help me come to an understanding of this, I named the book Surprised by Faith instead of Surprised by Joy. So that's kind of the history of the book that you have in your hand. And when he says that there are questions and answers, yes, there's questions and answers at the end of each chapter in the book. And there is also, we're going to go through tonight, why it's called Discovery, there are 10 discoveries. And don't be too worried if we're only at number 4 when we take the break, because the last ones go a little faster than the first ones do. And so don't worry about it. We'll make it to the end. And so this is I refer to this as discovering the aha of life. No matter where I go, whether I was in India, whether I was in the Marshall Islands, or no matter where I went, developing a ministry in the Philippines, the concept of aha, it seems to be recognized all over the world as the expression of discovery. And so there's a guy that made that first discovery. His name was Thomas. What's he known for? Doubting Thomas. And it was the first aha, maybe, discovery. But unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and I put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. Because the others had told him that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. And he didn't believe that was true. He wasn't there the first time Jesus appeared after his crucifixion. And notice that Jesus told him, "Go jump, Thomas." Or didn't he? Did he discourage Thomas? No. Look what he said. "Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." In other words, he welcomed his need for evidence. You need evidence, Thomas? Here it is. Come and look. Check it out. And I think that's the spirit in which we're approaching our approach to evidence tonight. You need evidence? God has provided it. Just have an open mind that you're willing to take a look at it. And Thomas did not say this in Scripture, but I kind of think he was thinking of it. Aha is what he did. So as we go along, every time we come to a conclusion of one of the 10 discoveries, you have to participate, even if it's just a little bit below your dignity. To do so, every time we come to a discovery, you have to go, aha! And that way I'll keep you awake a little bit. Now, this is the third edition of the book, and just a little misconception. You're getting it free, and if you went to the bookstore and said, "I want to buy Surprised by Faith," you would pay $13. And so that's the actual retail. We sell it through our office in Minneapolis for $10 all the time. But here, you're even getting it below that. You're getting about half price if you want to get another one for somebody that you know that has problems and questions and issues like this. You might want to get one so that you could share it. in addition to the one that you have. Want to watch in the right-hand corner of the slides? There you will find a number, oftentimes as I'm going through. And if you wanted to check it out, that's the page number in your book, the Surprised by Faith book. And so you could turn, especially when you see diagrams, you see pictures and things of that sort, they're probably in the book. And it'll have the page number in the lower right-hand corner. See there? We're going to start right there on page 15 of your book. That's the first chapter. Why am I here? That doesn't mean this evening. I hope you're not asking that yet. What in the world did I come here for? What we're looking at is, why do I exist? Why am I even here in this world? And, there's a lot of people. Do you realize that the incidence of taking your own life, suicide, is climbing significantly among people today. And it probably stems from the fact that they simply cannot find any reason or purpose for their existence. We want to look at that thing first in our discussion. Discovering that everyone has a crisis of purpose and meaning. If you came here tonight, life has been good to you. You are really quite happy. I'm going to see to it that you have a problem before you leave. Terrible seminar to go to. So purpose and meaning, I've been in the college scene, university scene quite a lot, and there you're going to find more of this than you will find it in rural America. But what you're going to find are philosophies that are being taught in our classrooms that all represent a denial. For example, if you looked at secular humanism or even socialism and Marxism, which is kind of rampant among some of the people in our country today, what their basically starting premise is that there isn't a God. The highest authority is humanity. We decide our future. We decide our destiny. There's no God. That's secular humanism. That's Marxism. Or scientific naturalism, those who think they want to put nature as the highest value. I don't know if you saw that on the news. It was so bad, I wanted to cry. This gal was saying in one of the recent meetings, she's been so alarmed by this problem of our change in our global, our climate change and everything else. And she says, we're overpopulated. We only have months. The New Deal, the Green Deal that's not fast enough. We got to do something about it more. We need to eat our babies. Did you hear that? Because we can't let them grow up that we overpopulate. That's a secular and scientific naturalist. Nature is more important than people are. The globe is much more important than people. And that's where they put their priority. Those are philosophies you're going to find in university classrooms everywhere across America. So they say there's no God, there's no such thing as the supernatural. Everything can be explained by natural means. And then there's the materialist. We're all kind of a part of this, but all reality is material. There's no such thing as the spiritual. So that when you and our bodies, we quit working. They don't work anymore. You're over. There is nothing to continue. All we are is a complex bag of chemicals. There's no spirit. There's no soul. They're materialists. So we're back to Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, where as he struggles with trying to figure out purpose and meaning in life, man's fate is like that of the animals. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is meaningless. Why would you want to live if that's the conclusion you come to? You have no higher purpose. You have no destiny. This is the crisis that happens when people eliminate God. They eliminate the supernatural. They eliminate spirit and soul. There's nothing left meaningful. There's nothing left to live for. Especially when life gets tough. You can be happy with life as it is. It's a big bowl of cherries when things are going well. But what happens when cancer hits? What happens when the death of someone you love takes place? At that point, you throw up your hands, you say, what's this all about? This does not make sense. And all of a sudden, you're into your crisis of purpose and meaning. And I bet we went around here and told stories about your individual lives. Probably most of us could name a crisis of that sort that calls into question whether this stuff makes sense or not. This whole thing we call life. So if there's no God, there's no supernatural, there's no spiritual, the triangle, no matter which classroom you go to in America today, I'm talking about a secular university, they're going to tell you what you see in that triangle is all there is. You have dirt, you have plants, you have animals, and you have people. That's it. Nothing else exists. And that's what you've got to use to get meaning, purpose out of your life. Living in that kind of a setting. What you conclude is death wins. Doesn't it? Whether I take my life or whether I wait for it to get me, death wins. How often? How often does death win? Every time. One out of one of us are going to die. And from that perspective, that's why I say, you came here, you were happy, but you're going to leave very sad. See, if you think you've got it all put together, then what else I have to say that's positive all through this evening? You don't care. You don't need it. Because you're in charge. You've got it all put together. But you've got to realize that you don't control death. And if that's going to be the end of us, what does the life leading up to that actually mean? If there's nothing more after that point. Into this world to eat and to sleep, and to know no reason why he was born, save to consume the corn, devour the cattle, flock, and fish, and to leave behind an empty dish. You obeyed your mother, clean your plate, and that's what life is all about. Someone wrote anonymously, I have no idea who wrote that. Or as Ernest Hemingway, starting as a great journalist and then became a great writer and so forth, life is just a dirty trick, a short journey from nothingness to nothingness, which he said before he committed suicide. See, it'll catch up to you eventually. It's however important to build a foundation that's different than those philosophies that I was sharing with you. The Christian worldview, the Christian biblical perspective will lead to hope. It leads to a destiny which is eternal. You can poo-poo that if you want to. But I'm going to try to share how you get there through faith search discovery. So, discovery number one, death is the ultimate and final conqueror if the finite world is all there is. And keep in mind everything we know in that triangle. People, animals, plants, dirt, soil, they're all finite. None of them have any way to tell you how you got here, why you're here, and where you're going. These are the ultimate questions of life, but these cannot provide it, the finite. You need to have the infinite would be the only source for that kind of information. Let's go to the second Discovering the fingerprints of a purpose-giving God in both nature and history. Those of you that were here this morning, you got this already. But I'm going to share a little bit of this so that those of you that came tonight but weren't here when I shared about the nature and history this morning, I don't want to leave you out. So this I can't go into at all except to point it out. The fingerprints of intelligent design are all over nature. There's illustrations all over nature that indicate this could not have happened by chance. There has to be an intelligent source that stands behind what we see in that triangle. People, plants, animals, dirt. It cannot be explained. Just like I said this morning, Mount Rushmore can't be explained by millions of years of wind and water erosion. Nobody would believe that. Why are you believing that a universe can come about as a result of random chance? If you can't believe iPhones do, or shoes, or cars, but you can accept that a universe can come about by chance? That's the fingerprints of God in nature. And even Albert Einstein, one of the brilliant minds, said the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. Why should there be order? Why should it make sense? Why isn't, he says, why isn't it chaotic? And why would we even be here if it was the result of chance? One should expect a chaotic world if it is random processes of chance. Points again that nature tells us that there must be an intelligence behind our existence and that of the universe. But it doesn't tell us who it is. We have to go to history to find that out. But Romans 1:18-20 is a scriptural basis for the point I'm making here. For that which is known about God is evident. How is it evident? Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Those who perpetuate the philosophies of no God, God in Scripture says they are without excuse. I have left my fingerprints all over the world for all to see. It would take denial to suggest that we are all the product of chance. In there, when you were coming in, I was going to skip this, but I forgot I'd told him to duplicate it, so I dare not use it. But that sheet that you had then when you came in, the big 8.5 by 11 one, with that picture on the side there, bring it up, take it out right now, if you would. And the parable that represents, and I have it quoted on there, but you'll find that on page 20 and 21 in your textbook, Surprised by Faith. That's that quote that's on that sheet, 20 and 21. Let me read it and point out the objection that I would receive in a university classroom if I said what I just said to you tonight so far. Once upon a time, two explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds, and some explorer says, well, some gardener must tend this plot. So it's like that garden you see right there in the picture. Is there a gardener or isn't there a gardener for that plot? And so they pitched their tents, and they set up a watch. But no gardener's ever seen. But perhaps the person says, he's an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence, they electrify it, they patrol with bloodhounds, but no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received a shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry, yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener who's invisible, who's insensible to electric shocks, a gardener who comes secretly to look after this garden which he loves. At last a skeptic despairs, but what remains, I'll put it up, what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, an intangible, And an eternally elusive gardener different from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all. When you say there's a God, how do you know you're not just imagining it? It seems comfortable to say so. But if you can't see him, and he never shows up, how do you know it's not just your imagination? How can you separate your statement about God from no gardener at all when you have no evidence? Now, do you see why I said this morning, and for those of you that are new tonight, we have to have the evidence of history to give an answer to the existence and the identity of God? Why? Because Christianity's answer to this is the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Christianity's claim is that Dr. Flew, the atheist who proposed this parable and is used in universities all across America to destroy the faith of the young freshmen who are coming into the university. And they're not prepared to give an answer because they didn't take my lecture this morning. What do I mean? Nature reveals the fingerprints of an intelligent creator. But in order to know who it is, that creator needed to show up on planet Earth. And that's exactly what Christianity says happened. God became flesh and lived with us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John chapter 1. The only religion in the world that gives an explanation that you can know who it is. His name is Jesus. Now, this sounds rather exclusive, but go ahead. Look at Judaism. Look at Islam. Look at Hinduism. Look at Buddhism, and see if any of them can offer any possible way to identify who the intelligence is that stands behind the universe. 80%, by the way, 8 out of 10 people in the world believe there is a God. And they're getting that information from their observation of nature. They know this couldn't possibly happen without an intelligence that stands behind it. But they don't know who it is. And that's why Jesus, when he was here for that time, and after his resurrection, he was here on earth for 40 days. And during that time, he had one thing on his mind: go and tell. Go and tell. You are the only people that know who God is, because you've come to know me. Go ye into all the world and tell all the nations who God is. And of course, by his resurrection, he conquered that problem. Remember the problem? The first discovery? What wins? Death wins. And only Jesus has ever demonstrated that he has authority and power that is greater than death. He had resurrection power, and he says, you will be with me. So death all of a sudden becomes simply a passing from one life to the next. And there's no despair. It's in fact something you look forward to. I don't mean death, but I mean the fact that there is life after death. It's the only religion that offers that kind of hope. And sometimes we're embarrassed to say that to people. We need courage because we have an answer that could give life to people who are finding their lives in desperation. So you can go down through the sheet, and I asked some questions there in the sheet that I don't want to take time. We're going to rob our being able to finish on time if I spend any time more with that. But you see the point of that. That's exactly what university professors are going to say. You can't see God. Nobody's seen God. Therefore, it's just your imagination. And if you fall for that, then you have not understood that the Christian faith says we're not imagining it, for our God showed up. You see the difference? He showed up. He did exactly what Flu says they should. If he's invisible, he's intangible and eternally elusive. If you went to the first epistle of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, look at it on your own. John says, that which was from the beginning, which our eyes have seen, our ears have heard, and our hands have handled of the word of life. So this isn't a phantom. This isn't a ghost. This is a real person that we were with in the first century. But if there is a God, not any God will do. Just to say G-O-D doesn't solve the problem. God would have to be an infinite. Remember we said everything else is a finite. God would need to be infinite, or else he has his own problems. He doesn't know where he came from, he doesn't know why he's there, and he doesn't know where he's going. But an infinite is absolute in terms of knowledge, in terms of knowing everything. And so the other characteristic of God that would have to be true, you can have 100 more, but the other one that would be absolutely essential is that God has to be personal. A person, I don't mean a personality, a person with intellect, will, and emotion. You see, the only way that if there is an intelligence out there that could communicate with us, we would have intelligence and would be able to communicate. Otherwise, it could be and show us power, but we wouldn't be able to get to know him. He'd have to be able to communicate in a way that we could understand. And that's, of course, why we have the Bible. And that's why Jesus came and spent 33 years here to communicate, so that we could have a perfect understanding of God, what his will is for our lives, and what reality is, what truth is. When you go to the East, you go to Hinduism, you go to Buddhism, you find them emphasizing that God is in fact infinite. God is so infinite that they have a concept called pantheism. Well, God is all. And all is God. There is nothing that is not God. The pew is God. Everything is God. But a person? They don't know anything about that. There's no person there. Not in Hinduism and Buddhism. There's nobody home. It's a force. It's like wind. It's like lightning. It may manifest power, but you can't possibly know anything about God that they maintain must exist. You go to the West and you get into the Greek world, you get into the Nordic peoples in the north, they emphasize that God is a person. Read the Greek mythologies. And you see all the Greek gods, they all manifest personhood. They have intellect, will, and emotion. The problem is they're not big enough to be God. They have more problems than the people do. They lust and they fight and they don't know what's going on. They're personal, but they're not infinite. So religions either err on the side of making God only an infinite and not personal, or only a personal but not infinite. Where do you go to find a God that is both? 3 places. Only 3 religions have that, and that's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Maintain that their God is both a person and infinite at the same time. Well, then they must be all the same. Well, maybe not. What does Islam and Judaism say? They claim that God communicated to them, the God that is infinite, the God that is personal, via the Pentateuch of Moses, via the Quran of Muhammad. But what would atheist Flu say to them? But can you see him? And they'd have to say, he's still invisible, he's still intangible and eternally elusive. What does Christianity say? I already told you. That God became flesh. Claims God came to earth 2,000 years ago physically as the God-man, Jesus Christ. We have, therefore, a complete difference between any other religion and Christianity in regard to the nature and the person of God. Aha! Discovery number 2. Christianity alone claims we can know who God is because he came to earth physically as the man Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. What holiday do we celebrate when God came into history? Christmas. Celebration of Christmas is based on the fact that it's a celebration of when God showed up on planet Earth, when God came into history. Oh, destroyed, you thought it was about presents, isn't that right? Oh, Pastor, I forgot I have some sound. Can I plug it in now? Can you do sound or not? Okay, well, we won't do it then. We'll just see. I have a woman, a man on the street in Minneapolis, interviewed. Do you think the Bible is true? And it's amazing. I'll go to the end of it, and I'll show you what they said. Here's their objections. The records of Jesus are fiction. You ever heard that before? The records of Jesus have been changed over the years. Therefore, what you're reading and what you're seeing in the Bible is not what was originally true. And there's no historical evidence for the records of Jesus. Summarizing the 6 interviews that were on that video, that's essentially what they said. We were on the Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, and whoever happened to come by that day, we were interviewing the people, and then it was put together in a kind of a collage of results. But that's kind of a summary of what people on the street think. Therefore, they're going to discount everything I've been telling you. What are you going to say to them? Or are you there with them? Let's look at, is the Bible true? For those of you that were here this morning, please forgive me, but there will have to be just a little bit of duplication on this item that we covered this morning together. But for the sake of everybody that's here tonight, we do need to touch on this a bit. Textual integrity means, how do I know that the text that I'm reading, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, how do I know I can trust that text to be actual reality, to be true to someone's full observation? Well, that's what this is about. Or how do we answer those 3 objections that were on the video? Discovering manuscript evidence for the New Testament. By the way, there's plenty of people, even in academia, that'll put you down. There's misquoting Jesus. Bart Ehrman says in the book, the Bible's a false idol. I mean, you're worshiping the Bible. That's what you're doing. The Da Vinci Code. Anybody here old enough to remember the Da Vinci Code and the Da Vinci movie? In the book, he says everything our fathers taught us about Christ is wrong. That's the one who came. So there's plenty of people writing books, doing videos, and teaching our kids none of this stuff is true. Back in 50 years before Christ, the emperor of the Roman Empire wrote this book, the Gallic Wars, or sometimes it's published under the War Commentaries. I mean, folks, that's 50 years before Christ even came. You can imagine what good shape this is in. I say that because we have to look at how does a paperback show up in my hand from over 2,000 years ago when it was written. Well, that's back there, 50 years before Christ. But there's no printing press until the 15th century. How are you going to get this to a printing press so you can run off copies like I have in my hand? Well, they're going to have to use human copy machines. I'm pushing the wrong button. Scribes whose profession is to do copying. And they're going to have to copy this for 1,450 years by hand. Those copies are called manuscripts. We do it the same thing, don't we? If you write a handwritten something, we call it a manuscript. So we're looking at When we talk about manuscripts, we're looking at things that are all before the printing press, that are being found by archaeologists and others who dig up things, and they find these texts that are all handwritten. And of course, that's how the transmission would have to take place, and it's a very tedious and long time thing. Let's go down to those objections that people on the street said. The records of Jesus are fiction. That is, don't forget, the New Testament was written in the first century, about 100 years after this, between maybe 40 and 100 AD, in the first century AD. So it also has to be copied for a long, long period of time. Now, what you're looking at right here is a timeline, first century, second century. And this is in yellow because that's approximately the year in which Jesus was crucified and resurrected, according to the Gospels. The eyewitness time period probably ends at about 100 AD. In other words, if anyone knew Jesus, by the time 100 comes around, they're pretty much dead. So any eyewitnesses are no longer around after 100 AD. We want to make certain that the Bible, the New Testament particularly in this case we're talking about, was written during that time period of the eyewitnesses. Because when you get down here, we call that the red zone, and that's when legends of Jesus begin to be written. Particularly people who have an axe to grind, and they have some maybe agendas in their mind. They have teaching that they have developed, and they want to have someone to give authority to their teaching. Who better than Jesus? And so 150 years after Jesus is dead, and even after all the eyewitnesses are dead, people start writing books about Jesus. And they have erroneous ideas that they'd like to perpetuate. And it's called pseudepigrapha, a form of publication and writing in which the author is not the one named, but is put in there to make it appear that it's an eyewitness of Jesus. So you have the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas, as far as we know, didn't publish anything. So somebody, 150 years later, wrote a gospel including their ideas and put them into the mouth of Jesus and put Thomas's name on the book to make it look like Thomas wrote it. But because we can go figure out when the manuscripts began, we can say, Thomas was dead for 100 years before this thing was ever written. Thomas didn't write this. Or we have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Mary didn't write that. It too is in the red zone or beyond. We have the Gospel of Jude, the Gospel of Philip. Lots of things were written down there. Why is that a problem? Well, because things like this show up in those publications because they have religious views and ideas that are really out to lunch. Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." No hand clapping, no praise the Lord or anything. Jesus said to Peter, "I myself will lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Does that sound like Jesus? Does it sound like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? This is written by the person who claims to be Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas. Probably an erroneous religious view that they're trying to put into the mouth of Jesus, but they're doing it 150 years after everybody's dead who could set the record straight. Or one I didn't use this morning. Now his father was a carpenter and made at that time plows and yokes. Joseph, remember? And there was required of Joseph to make a bed for a rich man. And whereas one beam, that which is called the shifting one, was too short. And Joseph didn't know what to do. He made a mistake as a carpenter. The young child Jesus said to his father Joseph, "Lay down the 2 pieces of wood and make them even at the end next to you." And Joseph did as the young child said to him. And Jesus took the other end and took hold upon the shorter beam and just stretched it and made it equal with the other. And his father Joseph saw it and marveled, and he embraced the young child and kissed him and said, "Happy am I that God gave me this young child." You see, all the writings about Jesus that come 150, 200, and 300 years later all make him into a circus sideshow. From the moment his feet hit the ground, he does miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. Everything he touches is a miracle. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John know nothing of that. They're eyewitnesses. They said he never did a miracle until he started his ministry at 30 years of age. He was no sideshow in a circus. But that's what they make him into when they start writing legends. We don't want that to depend on in our lives. We want the truth. We want eyewitness testimony, not this kind of stuff. And that's some of the Nag Hammadi is one of the huge caches of manuscripts that have been found that were all written regarding Jesus and his teachings and that sort of thing about 100 to 200 years later. They found them in Egypt. The actual authors are not eyewitnesses of Jesus. And they're the Gospels like that. We don't want that. We want to prove that we have people who were actually with Jesus and their enemies were there too, so that they could tell them, "You guys are out to lunch. I was there too, and I didn't hear him say that. I never saw him do that." So you can't get away with that kind of exaggeration when your enemies are there too. The Apostolic Fathers, these are the students of the apostles Paul, John, James, Jude, all the big names that you read about in the Gospels. These are their students. They're the next generation of leadership for the Christian church. They were born in the first century. They were students during the first century of those apostles, but they didn't know Jesus. That is, they were too young to have ever met Jesus in history. But they are the ones who are writing letters to the churches after Paul dies, after Peter dies, after James dies. They're the ones that are now writing letters. What do they write about? By 110 AD, Polycarp, a student of the Apostle John, refers to 18 New Testament books in the letters. You can look at them. You could open this, and you could read those letters, and you can see when he quotes Scripture as he writes to the churches. 18 New Testament books he cites, including all four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What would you have to conclude? They must have already been in existence. How can you quote what doesn't exist? So by 110, we already can demonstrate 18 of the 27 New Testament books must have been in existence. By AD 108, Ignatius quotes 24 of the New Testament books in his letters enclosed in this book, including all four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They must have all been in existence by that time. And Clement, by 96, refers to 11 New Testament books, including the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which means that 25 of the 27 New Testament books must have been in circulation by 95 AD and written considerably earlier, because in order to be in circulation, they have to be produced this way. Right? They handwrite them. That takes time, and they're expensive, and hard to get a wide distribution. Therefore, we're easily back into the lifetime of Matthew, of Paul, of Peter, of James, just like the church of Christianity has always taught. They were written by the people named in the Bible. They're not pseudonymous. They're not false. They are eyewitnesses. There's a papyrus, an early document, just a fragment. By the way, so you don't mislead, I don't mislead you and you don't mislead other people. When we talk about manuscripts, archaeologists have a way of equalizing everything. Every manuscript they find is one. Doesn't matter if it's a whole book, if it's a chapter, it's a verse. They all count one. The many manuscripts that we will identify here will be portions only, not the whole thing. This is a Magdalen papyrus, a part of Matthew chapter 26. Dr. Carson Peter Thiede, a papyrologist, has identified and believes that that was probably copied about 66 AD. So if you look at this, we have a portion of John's Gospel by 120. We have the Apostolic Fathers writing between 90 and 110, and now we're finding manuscripts in written form in the middle of the century, which is exactly what the church has always taught. These were written by the eyewitnesses of Jesus, the apostles. And the external evidence supports that. This is the one I was referring to. John, writing in the first letter, his first epistle, says, he's the one from the beginning. We've heard, we've seen, we touched him. This is not a phantom. Are the records of Jesus fiction? Like the people on Nicollet Mall said? No. It can be demonstrated that they are historically valid and they are written by the eyewitnesses of Jesus. Objection 2, the records of Jesus were changed over the years. We'll just do this one quickly. Notice the number of manuscripts that are found. The one that I had here that I was illustrating is that this one here. 251 manuscripts have ever been found for this book. Keep in mind, there are no such things as originals. Nobody, whether it be Judaism, whether it be Islam, whether it be Christianity, has no originals. So then what are we reading? We're reading they take the manuscripts that have been found, they compare them, in a sense, they reconstruct what is the best they could do from the manuscripts they have. They reconstruct what they believe the original must have been. You can see then that the more manuscripts you have, the more confidence you can have that you can restore it to great confidence. 251 is a lot of them, but 1,757 is even better. That's Homer's Iliad. But when you get down to some that are only it's double digits, 10, 20, 30, 40. By the way, I didn't pick up the bad ones here. This is a list of the best we know from ancient literature. These are the best ones with the most manuscripts. And that's pretty formidable. Oh, they shrunk. I wonder what happened there. Oh, I had to make room for the New Testament. Which ancient literature has the most manuscripts? The New Testament, is it close? Over 24,400 manuscripts have been found of the New Testament. If you want to reconstruct the original with 24,400 plus, you can do it with exceptional confidence, with exceptional certainty of what the originals must have been. How early? Well, you take this one and say, oh, well, that's pretty good, though, with 251. We can have, that's why professors put this out to their students to read, and they don't ever say a word about any possible question about integrity of the text. We had 251 manuscripts. Oh, but the first one's in 900 AD. 950 years after the emperor wrote it. Is that enough time for possibly some changes that the scribes could have made some errors along the way? 950 years of copying? But we have no manuscripts to demonstrate any of that. We have to trust the ones who find from 900 and after that they must be correct of the book that was written in 50 BC. But nobody ever says that. No professor ever warns their students there might be a question about the integrity of the text of a book like this they assign. But if I signed the New Testament, there would be an uproar. You don't want to read that. That's full of errors. That can't be trusted. And of course, they couldn't be more wrong. They've actually got the opposite than what they should have. They're trusting those that can't be trusted, and they're denying the one that can be. By literary standards. I'm not quoting the Bible. I'm quoting literature that should be known to all people. This should be taught in the public schools. This is not religion. This is a course in literature. But almost no one knows it because it's not taught. Look at Aristotle. Poetics is assigned to graduate students all the time. He wrote it in 4th century before Christ. There are no known manuscripts until 1100 AD. They were copied for 1,400 years, and we have no idea what they might have looked like during all that period of time, nor what the original might have been. But we trust it. We think it has integrity. Or Aeneid by Virgil, 300 years after the first manuscript, is about 300 years after he wrote it. Now compare that to the New Testament. The New Testament was written between 45 and 100 AD. All 27 books in the New Testament were written during that period of time, between 45 and 100. Where's the first manuscripts? We already looked at that. Starting to find manuscripts in the same century. Also in the 1st century. Were any of those other eras like that? No, they're separated by centuries from the author. But the New Testament can be found manuscripts that are starting to show up in the same century as the authors. And did they get changed due to copying over all those centuries to the printing press? No. You can find manuscripts of the New Testament in every century, all the way to the printing press. And go and look at them. Compare it to the one you're reading. And you'll find that they got transmitted during that 1,400 years without changes. The people who say they've been changed over the years do not know the facts. They don't know the information to draw a conclusion. What about the amount of change within it? You know, there could be some changes that are there, but maybe they're not so significant. How much, what we call distortion rate, when you look at one manuscript compared to another, to another, to another? Well, Dr. Bruce Metzger did a study of this, and he looked at the Mahabharata, which is a religious book of Hinduism. And he found that there's over 10% disparity from one manuscript to another to another. In other words, 1 out of every 10 lines, we don't really know what should be there. The Iliad has 5%. 1 out of every 20 lines, we don't know what Homer wrote. Because the manuscripts differ from each other sufficiently that we don't know which version or which thing should be put in there. But no professor ever points that out. That 1 out of every 20 lines is up for grabs. The New Testament, he found, has 0.2%. 99.8% of the New Testament is not in question due to transmission and scribal copying. So if you're concerned about the 0.2%, maybe it could keep you awake at night. But what ought to keep you awake at night is whether you're following the 99.8%. That's what you should be concerned about. But people say, well, what do you mean there's distortion? Keep in mind, this is only about manuscripts. The various manuscripts could have come out of Egypt, they could have come out of Rome, they could have come out of Syria, whatever. If you were to turn in your pew Bibles, or if you have one with you, and go to the last chapter of Mark's Gospel, which is Mark chapter 16. Give you a minute here to get there. Mark chapter 16, go to verse 8. Raise your hand if you're there already, and whether or not your Bible that you're looking at has any footnote or any indication on verse 8 that you might be referred to read. I don't know if the pew Bibles have that. Is there something there? Oh, you have your own. But then you have a note. What's it say? Yeah. In the Pew Bible, verse 9 has a bracket. The reason the bracket is on verse 9, and the bracket ends at the end of verse 20. It doesn't give an explanation why they put that in brackets. But somebody else must have a Bible that did put the footnote in. Yes. Can you speak up really loud? Read what yours says. Oh, you got a digital one.